All right. We are beginning with this program and session. Um, First of all, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the panelists and our international viewers. I'm so glad we are able to make this thing work from the comfort of our homes. Uh, well, the topic is pretty interesting today. The topic is algorithmic diplomacy, geopolitics, and international law, a new era. Now, this topic calls for discussion on a lot of aspects on certain myths and facts of artificial intelligence, on algorithmic diplomacy, information warfare, algorithmic decision making, etc. And to do justice to this topic, we have amazing panelists with us. We have a diplomat, we have founders, we have experts and researchers. And I must say that I had the opportunity to invite each and every one of the panelists, and I can confirm that they are one of the nicest people I've come across. And their discussions, the questions which they have put forth, actually helped us channelize the nature of this discussion. And I think this discussion would be really great. I have my Indian Evidence Act exam tomorrow, but I told to myself, there's no way I'm going to miss this panel discussion. Uh, I think then we can go forward. Abhivardhan, if you can just introduce our panelists so we can begin with the discussion.
Thank you so much, Akash, for this. So I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists today. And I agree with Akash, it's a very diverse panel. Actually, it's one of the most premier panels of the Indian Conference on AI and Law. So in this panel, we have Mr. Roger Spitz. He's the founder of TechXpansion. He is an AI investor and a very interesting luminary, I must say. We have Mr. Emmanuel Goffey. He's a PhD, and he is the head of the Observatory on the Ethics of Artificial Intelligence at the Institute Sapiens. We have from the Brookings Institution, Ms. Nicole Turner-Lee. We have Ambassador, I must say, Ambassador Yuji Garcia, who is the senior advisor to the President of the UN General Assembly on issues related to artificial intelligence ethics. And yes, alongside my co-moderator Akash Manwani, who is a research analyst at Internationalism, and my introduction being Abhivardhan, the chair of ISAIL and the president of the Indian Conference on Artificial Intelligence and Law, is actually the whole introduction. So let us begin with this session. We shall ask the questions, and at the same time, we will deal with the concerns of the audience as well. So it will be an amazing session. Akash, let's begin with the session and let's take the remarks forward. So the questions would be very basic, but let's get a very interesting understanding of all of this. So most of the times we'll assure that all the questions are dealt. If, for example, that does not happen, then what we will do is that you can mail the questions at IndoCon2020. Anyways, so let's begin. I have a question for Mr. Roger Spitz to begin with. So the question that I have is this. When we discuss the idea of algorithmic diplomacy, it's actually a very nascent idea because it has not developed technically. Algorithmic politics, algorithmic trading, all of that has come, but still it has not developed so much maturely, I must say. So the question that I have is this, that a major part of algorithmic diplomacy, when we say algorithmic diplomacy, it simply means that either diplomacy affects AI or AI is affecting diplomacy in a counterclockwise manner. So when this is what algorithmic diplomacy can possibly be. So a major part of algorithmic diplomacy generally, as per the geopolitical trends, would depend on algorithmic decision making, because decision making and AI have a very interesting connection. Companies, governments, and intellectuals are working on efforts to see how algorithmic decision making would come into play. I think we have numerous examples from the UAE to Israel to US to China to many. It's not very long from now that AI will play an active part in boardrooms and company management, because management ethics is a very integral part of AI. So what do we learn from these algorithmic developments? And how is it that we can, as human beings, can remain relevant in the future? So this is the question that I have. Thank you.
Thanks, Abhivardhan. So it's, of course, debate in terms of the semantics of AI and whether, how much AI is is pervasive today and its ability to make decisions. I try and look at it just in terms of a value chain of decision making. And of course, in the past, machines were typically used for optimization, to automate processes, accelerate repetitive tasks and that. But if you look at the value chain, which moves to augmentation and which also moves towards even tackling human mandated domains such as creativity, even drafting legal contracts or negotiations, you can see that little by little, AI is moving up that value chain. And I think that's undeniable. So whether the debate is in terms of the nature of AI and whether it's AGI or what have you, there's no doubt that in terms of the value chain, AI is having an increasing role in terms of moving towards decision making. And so that journey will continue, in my opinion, irrespective of its ultimate outcome. And that journey, where it increases to what are human mandated domains of decision making, will continue to increase. And therefore, I think what humans need to do to stay relevant, which I think is your question, is really understand where humans bring value. And I'm very much in agreement with, it's difficult not to be, but with Stephen Hawking, who considers the 21st century to be the center of complexity. And one of the features of complexity is that the unknown unknowns, there's no direct causality, or at least not ex ante, and that basically there's not necessarily a range of right answers. And so data and AI is less valuable in a complex domain than a complicated domain where at least there's known unknowns and a range of right answers and some more transparency and understanding of causality. And so within that framework, I would say that it's essential for humans to basically be more agile in the sense of understanding the entire systems, understanding that the cause and effect is not that predictable, and understanding the interdependencies of the moving parts, and therefore following emergence in terms of their own behavior to know where to amplify or dampen to move in the right direction, experimenting, tinkering, using innovation so that the instructive patterns can emerge. And I think that that emergence, in particular, the agility to emerge in complex systems, is one where humans have an edge. But to do so, we need to acknowledge where our value is. And we need to acknowledge that today we are not necessarily good at being agile, at complex decision-making, and at emergence. And therefore, I think that there's a need for humanity to understand in terms of the education system and the leadership teams and the way companies operate and organizations, what it means to be anticipatory, to be agile, and to be anti-fragile, and what it means to develop and upgrade those features when you're competing, quote unquote, against AI, which is continuing its journey in terms of decision making.
Thank you so much, sir. I completely resonate with you that the AAA formula really works, and we as humans need to find our value.
Thank you so much. So I would like to ask Akash to go ahead with the next question. Thank you.
Yes, Abhivardhan. Yeah, thank you, Abhivardhan. So coming back to the crux of the debate or the discussion itself, there's no multilateral wing at the international level when it comes to algorithmic diplomacy. And I think Mr. Eugenio Garcia would be the best person to answer this question. So, sir, my question to you is, at the outset, in your opinion, why, first of all, there is no an independent multilateral body on artificial intelligence or algorithms under the aegis of the United Nations, under the direct aegis of the United Nations? Well, if there is a future international artificial intelligence organization, how would it look like? What could or should be its objects, goals, scope, and powers? Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Yes, AI is a general purpose technology with multiple capabilities and likely long-term impact across the board. So as a background, I believe AI can pose risks that need to be prevented or mitigated. So setting standards, norms, and benchmarks to mitigate these risks are possible responses to the negative side of the technology. It's not just a question of doing good or promoting responsible behavior among states or protecting the weak from the dominance of the powerful. At the end of the day, it's a matter of negotiating disagreements, navigating uncertainties, and finding common ground to build accepted rules for all and minimal standards to safely develop the full potential of AI. So yes, there is no UN multilateral body on AI right now for a number of reasons. Technology has been evolving too fast. We don't know exactly what should be regulated and how. National legislation is still being discussed in many countries. So how do you engage in international negotiations on AI if your country has no policy or strategy on AI itself? So overall, the debate is beginning to take shape, but there is still much work to do. So it's probably too early for an international organization on AI exclusively. And if you try to be too ambitious from the very beginning, you can reach a wall pretty soon. Now, of course, we have a very challenging international situation today. People are skeptical of any substantive agreement among the great tech powers. We face scenarios of growing competition, interstate rivalry, AI nationalism, decoupling, and so on. So I think with the absence of forms of governance and mistrust towards the multilateral system can make it much harder for the international community to cope with today's challenges. And reaching a workable international consensus on this idea seems to me rather a remote possibility in the short term. But it's important to continue exploring alternatives to take concrete steps in AI governance in a robust and comprehensive manner. So you ask, what if sometime in the future there is an international organization on AI? And what should be the role of this organization? Well, ideally, it could be an international regulatory agency to discuss, promote cooperation, oversight, set standards, guide, implement AI policies globally to promote safe, beneficial, and friendly AI, both in the short term and in the long term. But again, how do you get there? So how do you strike a balance between soft law, for example, principles, recommendations, flexible cooperation arrangements, and binding commitments, norms that are supposed to be mandatory for states and other stakeholders? You can say signing an international treaty is too difficult. So agile governance is much easier. So let's work just with existing law. This should be enough. However, many people also say that if you only have soft law, there is no guarantee that these principles or recommendations will actually be implemented at the national, regional, and international level. So just to conclude, I think one key challenge is to keep the major players engaged so that AI governance can be instrumental in providing stability to safeguard the system in everyone's interests. So before moving to an international organization, maybe we could think of establishing first an intergovernmental panel on AI. So as you know, the UN has an intergovernmental panel on climate change, the famous IPCC, which has an extremely important role in giving scientific advice on climate change. So what if we decide to create a similar body on AI to provide policymakers with technical assessments underlying the opportunities and implications of potential risks of AI? So that's an idea maybe we could explore and discuss further. But as technologies become more and more sophisticated and difficult to understand for the public, this intergovernmental panel would play a key role, for example, giving sound technical advice. And for intergovernmental negotiations to be launched, we need to separate myth, hype, and misinformation, actual body of evidence available so far. So that's my submission to you, so that we can discuss further. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So in that regard, I would like to ask Nicole a special question on this. So the question is actually regarding the vices of algorithmic autonomy, because we know that the whole constituent nature of artificial intelligence when it comes to practicality is that it is very disruptive. And the vices of disruption obviously exist. So my question to the panelists is in this way, that we have come across several vices of algorithmic autonomy. I think I can name at least 10s and 20s of them, if I may. But is it also possible that algorithmic autonomy, which is, I think, a very important aspect which countries are proposing themselves, the EU especially, and the Americans, is it possible that algorithmic accountability can have a positive impact in the realm of international relations? I would really await this. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everyone. And I bring greetings from the Brookings Institution, where I am the senior fellow in the governance studies, as well as the director of the Center for Technology Innovation. So I think that's a really interesting question in terms of algorithmic accountability or algorithmic, accounting in terms of the public sectors and international relations and whether or not it can have a positive effect. And I would suggest, and particularly the work that we do at Brookings, that technology generally can have an either-or effect, and in many respects, that's why we're having the conversation today. Technology has the ability to enhance. It has the ability to become much more efficient in terms of its praxis. It has the ability to create the type of relationships that cross borders. But at the same time, technology can be harmful. It can have, as it said, vices. It can have areas where it can liberate, while at the same time it can oppress or create systemic biases that keep people contained into certain realities, whether it is the use of technology for elections, where it is basically expounding and expanding upon freedom of speech, or in the case of the use of technology in elections, where it's actually stifling people's ability to vote, or it is creating misinformation or disinformation that essentially, restricts people's ability to exercise a democratic right. With that being said, I want to start with some of the positive uses and then sort of end up my comments on where we have to really reel in these vices, particularly when we're talking about international. First and foremost, we have seen technology become very, very useful in the solving of problems around climate change, around national security, around educational issues and concerns, around commerce, and around the portability of data. The new innovations that we are seeing in AI, essentially, and as someone mentioned it, as a general purpose technology, has allowed us to do things that we as humans could not do at such an accelerated pace or without the preciseness of the decision making that a computer system actually brings. And those technologies will continue to advance what I believe are public good applications that lend itself to even greater causes like poverty or the lack of food or food insecurities, health or housing. Those are areas I personally believe, and we at Brookings in studying this think are magnificent fortitudes of the technology of which we're talking about. But at the same time, those technologies often can engender the same type of biases, the same types of discriminations that take the question of solving climate change and sort of geo-fence in, or surveil communities and land for the purposes of systemic discrimination or inequality. And so a great example of that, and I will share for the United States, is the use of algorithmic accountability and criminal justice applications. Whereas we know that judges may have high workloads and high tasks when it comes to high-risk decision making, the use of risk assessments in the accountability of those algorithms can actually err on the side of further criminalizing or over criminalizing certain populations because the data in and of itself starts out flawed. You know, when I talk about algorithmic accountability, I always suggest to people that it's not the computer system that, in many respects, actually creates the biases. It is all of us on this call who bring a set of norms, values, and assumptions about the world that actually feed into those systems. And that has also international implications. How we actually look at the design of AI also comes with our lived experiences based on where we are located in the world, based on where we are located in the context of the problem that we're trying to solve, based on who we are and how we want to exert power and influence in those models. These are real issues. And I know we're going to talk about this coming up, but why we call these vices is because the very thing that we are designing to help us to accelerate the speed of thought have the ability to be weaponized against certain populations and have the ability to sort of box in populations. So going back to that criminal justice algorithm that we talk about in the United States, you know, it is great that judges have the preciseness of a computer model to determine the threat to society when it comes to individual defendants. But it is not so great when the majority of those defendants are Black and brown people in the United States who tend to be overrepresented in those data sets where the model is drawing from. So we have to constantly ask ourselves, can we use a technology for public good when there are these inherent vices, these inherent insufficiencies, these inherent biases that in many respects may sort of void out. I always tell engineers, they void out or they silence the good simply because we've not necessarily dealt with holistically how to address those embedded biases that come from the societies in which we live. So I will end there, but I'm looking forward to having a conversation because if you do not couch this around civil and human rights, these conversations within these regulatory frameworks of how we proceed with these technologies, I fear, my friends, that we will have these very different sets of norms and values around algorithms, around machine learning algorithms, as well as AI systems in general. And we will have the ability for us to be much more separated and polarized in our applications of what are the right contexts of use, which in the end can be weaponized against certain populations. So very happy to be here and thank you. I had to switch computers because a minute ago you couldn't see me. And now I'm at a computer that you can actually see me, hopefully, is working better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Those are really some powerful views and powerful observations. And we really appreciate it. And we would like to have further conversation on this. And I guess that is the whole object of this discussion. Thank you so much. And well, yes, there are vices to technology. But again, there are positive views also. As you said, technology has brought great impact in commerce, education, climate change, etc. And maybe for all of us in this pandemic, I guess the only silver lining is rapid adoption of digital tools. So that is great. So moving forward on the same lines, considering that we have literally skyrocketed the adoption of digital tools, I would like to ask a question to Mr. Emmanuel Goffey. So in light of this, what is actually responsible AI or responsible artificial intelligence? What role would it play in developing trust in algorithms for sensitive matters like geopolitics and international relations? Could we ever trust algorithms with these things? Over to you, sir.
Okay, that's a really tough question for a philosopher, obviously. So there is no easy answer to this kind of question. The first thing that I want to stress is the use of those words. You were talking about responsible AI. We're talking about trustworthiness. These are words, right? And the first thing that I want to say, and especially when it comes to dealing with international relations, is that trustworthiness doesn't mean the same thing for you as it means for me, right? Maybe there are some interconnection, but in some countries, trustworthiness does not have the same sense as here in Europe or even in Northern America. The same thing for responsibility, right? We all know lots of countries that from our side, through our lens, would be labeled as irresponsible. So responsibility and trustworthiness are really complex. That's the first point that I want to not stress. The second point that I want to not stress as well is the fact that you cannot apply those words to a technology. Actually, if I just take the case of trustworthiness, I've heard a lot about, and especially here in Europe, we're talking about developing this trustworthy AI. My concern is that you do not trust AI. You trust the people that are developing AI, and you trust people that are using it, right? AI is just a tool, except if at some point AI becomes fully autonomous, and if AI is able to make decisions by itself. But so far, it's not the case, right? So there is always someone behind those algorithms. There's a programmer, there is a user, there are a lot of people that can be held responsible for what is going on with algorithms. So you really have, and I think that's really important to separate those two words. Trustworthiness and AI doesn't make sense. It just my opinion on that is I have a strong stance saying that trustworthiness, when we use trust or when we use responsibility like explainability and transparency, these are just mere marketing tools, right? We're just trying to make people feel better with that, feel more comfortable with AI. But I would definitely ask you the question, all of you that are watching this today, is trust something that is really necessary? And I feel like, for example, in countries like democracy, right? I'm in France and living in Canada for a while, is not based on trust. It's based on distrust, right? We have a lot of things that prove that, right? The system, the political system that we have here in France is based on the fact that we cannot truly trust each other. So we have to put safeguards in order to make sure that everyone will be able to benefit from all that is available in the society, right? So trust is not something that I like. On the contrary, I would say that yes, I have really to be vigilant on what I'm doing and what kind of tools are developed. I have to be vigilant towards the people that are developing those tools. I have to be vigilant toward the people that are using those tools, right? But the tool itself doesn't matter. Technically speaking, so far, once again, we are not yet in the situation where we have autonomous AI that is able to make its own decision based on its learning, right? So at the international level, I would definitely say that this is kind of a tough issue, because when you look at the way people are understanding those words, you will see that there are lots of differences. And I just want to move to another point that is directly related to that, and that is something that I'm working on in the Observatory on Ethics of Artificial Intelligence here in Paris, and also with the school I work with, Identity School for Technology, Business and Society. We are really interested in a bias that has never been tackled at all, right? We hear a lot about gender bias, skin colors bias, this kind of thing, or social status biases. But there is a bias already at the international level, which is the fact that most of the ethical debate is influenced by Western thoughts, not by India, not by Africa, not by China, not by Japan, not by even, I would say, Southern America, right? And this is a big, strong bias that we have. We are all using those words because those words have been developed by Western countries. Look at European Union. We have this kind of word in our GDPR, in our rules to get exactly the same codes regulating AI in Northern America. And weirdly, because we do not share the same culture, you will find exactly the same words in the Chinese documents that have been, and especially there is one that has been issued quite recently, which is about AI and children. All right. So if you look at those codes, you will find that it's really striking that the wording, the sentences, everything is almost the same, right? With some differences, and I cannot understand that because we do not share any kind of culture with China. I do not understand why they are using us, and especially when you look at doing or other countries. I feel like there is kind of a weird use of those words, so they do not resonate the same way here in Europe. So there is a strong bias at the international level that we really have to address quite quickly, and we're working on that once again with the Observatory and Identity. We will launch a big study on that to see how this ethical debate could be renewed using different wisdoms, different culture, different perspectives, different religions from all around the world, just to see where those different religions can bring something new to this question. So far, there is a big bias, a big, huge bias about how we tackle ethics. And I would say even this bias is even greater because even if you look at the way we deal with ethics here in Europe, the Western world, I mean, it's only through the three main theories. I mean, virtue, ethic, consequentialism, and the ontology, right? While there are lots of other ways to see that. Let's mention, for example, the ethics of care by Carol Gilligan, the ethics of responsibility. Lots of, by Hans Jonas, get a lot of people that have written on that, and we do not even look at them. We don't even study them. Most of the people that are doing ethics are studying Aristotle. They will be studying Jeremy Bentham or even Immanuel Kant or Stuart Mill, but they will not look at other philosophers or other thoughts from other countries, other cultures. So this is really something that we have to work on, and we really have to step back from all those words that we put with AI and that actually do not make sense at all. They do not resonate in our mind the way they resonate in the minds of people of other countries.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suhaid. Actually, it was amazing. I would like to ask our panelist, Mr. Bogdan. So Mr. Bogdan also attended the first panel on the AI policy considerations. And that panel was, I must say, amazing. This also is going amazing. So, I think it's a very interesting question which I have in my mind, which is about the issue of myth busting in AI ethics. So we are talking about algorithmic decision making, philosophy, and understanding the critical realities. Country to country differs. So the question that I have for you is this, that in the interest of myth busting, how probable is algorithmic decision making, autonomy, and human intelligence? Does it mean that AI really needs to be that kind of super intelligent in that sense, or just intelligent enough to outsmart us in order to replace us? Considering in context of what Professor Max Tegmark and I must say Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, these eminent intellectuals have enumerated about. So I would really be happy to know your views.
In short answer, no, it doesn't. It just needs to be good enough to be better than us. When I say better, I'm not saying necessarily more efficient. It's just we don't evolve and keep pace in terms of morality, in terms of how we do things, in terms of how we treat each other, and so on. Now, I think that there's quite a number of researchers and scientists that believe that general artificial intelligence will never be achieved. So actually, nobody knows, but it doesn't have to be truly autonomous to create disasters. The onus is on us, the people. Technology is neutral. If anything can be neutral, it's technology. And, end of the day, it boils out to the question, what kind of society we want, and use concepts as artificial intelligence and technologies related to it, like machine learning, computer vision, robotics, and so on, to make the planet and the society better. That's really where the onus is on us, the people, not on a concept. I think Mr. Goffey explained it very well, where he said that these terms don't really resonate in the same way across the world, and we should take that into consideration pretty much equally, I would say, not just looking at things from one viewpoint or another, because it's actually dangerous with this kind of concept. It really is. And Mrs. Lee talked about human rights. I mean, that's real. We already have human rights issues. We have, I talked at the last panel about the case in US where somebody could not challenge a judicial decision that was made based on the output of a machine learning system, because there's no laws around it, and because the judge deemed that intellectual property rights, i.e. commercial secrets, take precedence over the human rights of the accused to challenge a judicial decision. I mean, I'm not sure what kind of sentence it was, but it involved a criminal record. It cannot get more serious than this, in my opinion. But it's again about us people, not about AI or the technology. That's really it. When it comes to AI taking over the world and enslave people, people enslave each other really. Wherever they use a concept to do that or not, really, again, technology not going to enslave people. It's what we make of it that enslaves people. That's really my take. When it comes to superintelligence and so on, as I said, nobody can agree if it's even really possible. There are bright minds out there that argue that it's never going to be possible. I'm a little bit wary of that. I prefer to be vigilant, as Mr. Goffey said, and always ask, what if? What if that will happen? Because if that will happen, it's not going to be like that. It's going to be a relay course. One step at a time that would seamlessly get us there. And before anyone realizes it, it's there, and we are in deep trouble, and we start asking ourselves, how is that possible? That's all I had to say. So vigilance, and let's ask ourselves what kind of world we want to live in. That's where the onus is on us, not on the tech.
Thank you so much, sir. Well, what I think is nobody knows what future is going to bring with itself. So it is better to be vigilant and not get complacent with it. We need to take care of ethics and the people who really make these artificial intelligence tools or computers or algorithms, as Mr. Goffey said. Moving further, bringing back the discussion to geopolitics and international law, I would like to ask Mr. Eugenio Garcia. So we have seen applications like Instagram having a lot of a tremendous impact on setting the diplomatic narrative. So you being a diplomat, I want to ask how algorithms are impacting diplomatic narrative on or influencing the worldview, as we say. Could social media algorithms actually make a whole population of a nation believe in something?
Well, thank you for your question. Maybe not the whole population, but you certainly can use social media algorithms to make millions of people to believe in something. And this ability to manipulate public opinion for political purposes is not really new. So think of Nazi Germany in the 30s and how massive propaganda convinced millions of Germans that Nazism was perfectly fine and should be supported. So the problem now is the power of AI as a manipulation multiplier. So a political regime, for example, can use data collection and AI tools to identify you, to know where you are, track your movements, control the information you receive, and so on. And this is not only true for authoritarian states, but even democracies, as you know. The situation is challenging. We face a democratization of disinformation, or the very notion of surveillance capitalism, and how personal data can be used to sell products, generate profits, make you more willing to go in a given direction, depending on what's at stake. Emmanuel talked earlier about bias. There is now a great debate on how social media, the internet, bots, fake news, and the apps in your smartphone can be utilized to reinforce beliefs and strengthen in-group thinking, which can increase, of course, polarization in politics. We can call it bubble fights. You live in a bubble of information. You think you are right, and you oppose any different opinion, and nobody listens to each other. But having said that, let me go back to the first point of your question on the impact of algorithms in diplomacy. Diplomacy happens in a political space where foreign policy is made. So having the public opinion on your side may be a strategic resource, in particular if you are trying to sell to the public a specific narrative or to justify a policy or to push your ideas to make people support them. So no wonder governments everywhere are now much more active on social media, on Twitter, other platforms. It's a battle for hearts and minds, to win the crowd, to shape people's minds. So all these AI tools that can be used to control public opinion may end up having an impact on diplomatic discourse as well. And in the digital age, this ongoing transformation has been around for some time. So 2 points here to conclude. First, the tension between traditional old-style diplomacy and the changes brought about by technological innovation with all this real-time information is spreading around the globe. Some people say that the UN, for example, needs to adapt to a new digital environment. And that's true. If the UN is too slow or too bureaucratic, it won't be able to deliver in this century. So I agree we need a more inclusive multilateralism and embrace more stakeholders in all these debates. And second, then came COVID-19. The good news is that the pandemic accelerated the adoption of several applications, virtual Zoom meetings, working from home, more connectivity, and diplomats had to take crash courses on the internet to catch up and to use these new technologies in a more efficient way. So there are more opportunities to connect online. But the bad news, and there are always two sides of the coin, these virtual meetings don't allow real face-to-face interactions. So some sensitive negotiations were made more difficult. And informal dialogue outside of these virtual meetings is not the same anymore. So diplomacy lost in the process. And I mean here diplomacy as a way to reach agreements when people disagree. So it's easy when everybody's on the same page. But when countries have very different views on the topic being negotiated, that's the challenge. So again, bubble fights. You are right, but nobody listens to each other. So to conclude, the problem with AI in diplomacy is that foreign services are slow to adopt these new technologies, especially in their daily work. So in general, this is my perception as a practitioner. There's a long way to go until AI tools are really incorporated by the diplomatic community. You can say that there is a great potential, I don't know, for instance, human-machine hybrid decision maker, but this is far from the reality on the ground for most foreign ministries. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think it was a great insight on the same issue. So I have a question to our panelist, Nicole. And the question is on this aspect with regards algorithms, biases, and how they affect at national level. So yes, it is understandable that diplomacy itself, when it comes to multilateralism and AI, is still not reaching there because grounds of consensus are not easy. And I think it might not be easy for some time. So my simple question on this aspect is, how algorithms really impact global challenges? And should nations come together and form a unified regulatory infrastructure? Like, for example, I think within the UN, there are some initiatives happening. Obviously, they are not some bodies, some working groups, some projects, certain collaborations with organizations and NGOs. Something is happening. Still, in that case, how can a unified regulatory infrastructure be made? Adding to this, considering the current administration in the US and whatever might come in the future, Trump or Biden, what role could the United States play in that case? So I would like to know your take. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that is a very, very interesting question. And as you all are watching the United States, we're leading up to a national election that may actually have some impacts on the future of AI policy. I mean, I think there's a couple of things at hand here. I mean, before we even speak about the United States and our election, there has been a constant struggle in terms of this race to AI. I do a lot of work at Brookings on Chinese technology and the extent to which we're actually seeing the Chinese really try to become the forerunner in terms of AI research and development and deployment. I mean, the Chinese government has been very clear that they want to be the first to deploy. And in partnership with countries across the world, you know, and particularly in the continent of Africa, we have seen them sort of invest these types of resources necessary to sort of expedite the development of these products. And we've seen them actually deploy them. I mean, it's something that we're seeing on the infrastructure side and something that we're equally seeing on the AI side. And I think the Chinese government has been very clear about the economic outputs and inputs as a result of this infrastructure. But at the same token, you know, we are seeing across the world these very disparate attempts to come up with standards and working groups. And for those of us who have been around for a while, that does not necessarily suggest that we're going to have operationalized principles and action statements that sort of lead the design and development of AI. And I think it goes back to what Emmanuel talked about, that depending on who you are and what country, you have a different perspective on what AI means. When I travel around the world, you know, when I talk about civil rights in the American context, that's very different from human and civil rights in Italy and other places, Chile, where people are starting grappling with the diffusion of technologies and the impacts that they may have. And that does not even involve something that I'm writing a book about, which is the divide, the digital divide, and the extent to which we're not even counting for people in the design and development of these systems because they're not connected. So we have this challenge, as Bogdan kind of said, which will develop systems that may overlay the experience of people without necessarily knowing the impact on human subjects. So globally, when I think about, you know, where we have some blind spots, one is around the disparate investments in R&D that we're making across the world in AI systems. And the fact that those investments are coming in a variety of ways. Some of it is coming around, you know, lab development and modeling, et cetera, academic research. Others are coming around, you know, ways in which policy structures and national security structures will actually rely upon the AI to sort of lead the national race. I was on a panel with Wired Magazine with Ian Bremmer, where he referred to this as an AI Cold War, which really scared me. Because again, I think it has a lot to do with this disparate investments, as well as the positioning of AI within different countries as to its worth. And I think, as it was mentioned earlier, I keep going back to AI is a general purpose technology, and it can be used for the good or the bad. With that being said, we're going into a national election here. And many of you may have been up, as I woke up, to the news of just the extension of the coronavirus now to our administration. And so we wish nothing but blessings on our First Lady and our President to get out of this, because this has a huge effect on diplomacy here in the United States. And I think it sends a message around the world about the severity of this pandemic. With that being said, depending on who actually takes that lead next year will be very interesting. At Brookings, I've written about this. What would an AI policy look like under Biden and Harris? It may look very different. It may look similar. One thing that we will know that it will be a different approach to diplomacy, AI diplomacy, that we may not see today. The United States actually has done a very good job from the administration in terms of coming up with standards around AI, around quantum computing. But the extent to which we have been fully cooperative, I know we have signed into some of the pacts with the OECD and the United Nations, but the fact that we're fully cooperative may actually switch or flip a little bit with a Biden-Harris administration, but it all depends on who they put into office. And I think at the end of the day, we need global cooperation, and I'll end here, because AI systems have this beautiful potential to solve human problems with the help of humans, of course, and the design of those models. But in my work, and I continue to stress this with my global partners, it can be weaponized. enforce national security vulnerabilities, where systems that include financial systems to global climate change systems cannot just be weapons of mass destruction that we have actually seen in the past, but they can be newly modeled weapons of mass destruction that actually infiltrate data systems that we all think have some level of data security. And AI systems and vulnerabilities globally go hand in hand with the disparate development of privacy structures that actually permit the portability and the types of data that are permissible across the world. And we don't even have that. And so I think as we think about, where do we go from here? The question is, and I've said this to our friends at Chinese think tanks as well, who wants to sit at the table so that we develop ethical AI, legal AI, an AI that does not implode human democracy in ways that we cannot pull it back. And that's something that we're seeing in the United States when simple applications of AI that find themselves in housing applications and in credit applications, employment and criminal justice, that the very technology that all of us dreamt would one day become an equalizer has the potential to actually really implode the facets of any type of human diplomacy and to bring us further apart. And so again, I think I'm one of those people, like, I want to say, as many people have said, they're great uses, but I think I err on the side of this club that without it being carefully tracked, I think we're opening up unopened cans of worms that have basically been settled, but we're also permitting it to do things that I think many of us in this audience do not want to see it do. And I know our friends in India are grappling with the same types of challenges. In fact, just a shameless plug, we've just brought on to the Center for Technology Innovation at Brookings, one of our friends who has worked in India's regulatory space to become one of our scholars. So just look forward to that type of collaboration as well.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Well, I'm sure these are certain interesting times for the United States. And irrespective of the political views, obviously, everyone will wish well for Mr. President and the First Lady. This only tells that COVID-19 doesn't see stature, position, caste, creed, or color. So everyone, please wear your masks when you go out. Anyway, moving forward, very quick question to Mr. Goffey. Why artificial intelligence ethics is important, and how do we effectively enforce it?
Okay, two other great questions, right? I would say that AI ethics is important because you don't have any kind of legal framework that is currently working. So it's better than nothing, I would say. I would obviously prefer having kind of a positive rule, positive documents, and international laws that would be really constraining. But that's not the case, and we know that this technology is evolving at fast pace, and it's really, really tough to find, as you mentioned before, it's really difficult to find compromises on this. And obviously, you know that behind this technology, there are strong interests. Diplomatic and financial interests that are at stake. So it's really hard to find to write kind of a legal framework. So ethics is here just to compensate the fact that the law is definitely not efficient enough so far. But on the other end, I would say that we should not hide behind what I call cosmetics, which is kind of a veil, just making things better than they are really, right? Obviously, you can use this kind of cosmetics using these beautiful words, those beautiful values, and putting them forward, saying, okay, look, you can trust us because we are this and that, because we are democratic countries, because we are, inclusive, because we value the diversity and all that things. The point here is that those words must be seen with a lot of caution, obviously. So ethics is important, obviously, but I would say also real ethics is important. And this is where, and as a philosopher, that's a big issue that I have. Lots of people are actually entering into the debate because ethics is kind of a buzzword, right? When I say ethic, you all understand what I mean, but you don't know what it is exactly, because ethics is something really complex, obviously. So if I go deep into this this complexity, you should be lost. But anyone can just go on a TV show and say, oh, look, we are doing ethical things. That will resonate in the mind of the people, audience, obviously, in a way that they will say, okay, that I can trust him because he's or her, because they're ethical people, right? But it mainly is cosmetics when it's not used by real philosophers, but by people that do have this background in philosophy. When you hear a political statement, when you hear a private company's statement, most of the time, it's not really ethics, it's cosmetics. Once again, because it cannot be operationalized, right? And when you say, how can you apply that? You cannot apply that for many reasons. First of all, because those kind of ethical rules, most of the time, they do not apply to some countries. So when you look at the UN, we all agree, and I've done that regarding the lethal autonomous weapons, right? I've participated to this kind of debate discussion. We're all around the table from different background, different culture, engineers, philosophers, historians, political leaders, etc., etc. We are discussing this big issue on the ethical and the legal standpoints. And we were all nodding at each other, saying, "Oh yeah, that's really interesting. I do agree with you. That's it." And when we'll leave actually the room, we feel like, okay, I will do whatever I need, whatever I want, right? You feel like sometimes the rules that have been set do not really are not really matching your expectation, your culture, your ideas, your perspective, your stances. So the problem is that with ethics, there is no way that you will apply them for sure. And the second thing with ethics is that conversely to law, there is no constraint behind that, right? There is no sanction. There can be symbolic sanction in terms of maybe your image can be reached or attained because you did not really respect your promises in terms of ethical statements. But that's almost it, right? You cannot be sued for not being ethical. You cannot be sued for that. So ethics is nice, is good, is interesting, is important, because there is nothing else that is available that is efficient. But we must not fall into the trap of cosmetics, just hiding the reality of life and to make it looking good. No, life is not that good. And obviously, when you're developing this kind of tool at the international level, there are stakes that are much, much, much higher than just ethical consideration. And I would say that if you look at private companies, the GAFAM, the BATEX in China, or even some countries, Canada, the US, France, Germany, China, you will see that if you look at the priority list, ethics is really low in the list, right? It's here because they know that it's important. If they want to sell the product, they have to reassure people and to make sure that people will be comfortable buying their product or using their product, right? But it doesn't mean that behind that there is a strong commitment or there is a strong conviction about the importance of ethics. It's just here to sell the product, and that's really something I want to warn everyone about, right? Be careful about people that are talking about ethics without having any idea of what ethics is exactly. Ethics is really, really highly complex.
Thank you so much. It was really an interesting take. So I have a question for our dear panelist, Bogdan. So let's take a different take on it. Okay, let's take a twisted take. So we had an amazing discussion in the AI General Assembly yesterday actually, about 5G and Splinternet. So the same question I'm going to ask you. And the question is this. In a slightly different take, what role would Splinternet and 5G play in AI development? So I would like to know what you think.
You keep asking me these questions, and I only have a few minutes to answer, and it takes really about 2 to 4 hours to answer it thoroughly. So I'll try to summarize. Well, put it shortly, 5G is a huge enabler for any AI type of technology. And why is that? It's because it's about the fuel, and the fuel, for any network, for anything digital, and for anything AI is the data. And 5G is a huge pipeline for huge volumes of data in a very short time, i.e. in a fraction of a second. It's let's forget about the theory and the lab, but in real life, we're looking at about 20 times higher, not just speed, but volume of data per second compared to 4G. It's actually much higher than any Wi-Fi out there, by about a factor of 5 to 10. Also latency, which means how fast, not how fast in terms of speed, but how reliable is the way you receive the data, i.e. do you have any lag? With 5G, in real world, it's 2 to 3 times better than 4G. And 4G is already pretty low, I would say. If you take the lab, I mean, that's way, way, way higher. But in real world, it's 2 to 3 times. So you have 20 times more data per second and 2 to 3 times less lag. That means, well, for Internet of Things, where you need typically really low latency, very good latency and very low lag, but also high volume, very high volume of data. And this is not just autonomous devices like, say, self-driving car or something like that, but also assistants, for example, in care homes, in hospitals, at home. 5G, you could see that gives that. So it's a huge enabler. Also, it helps with the frequency. So being a radio spectrum, there's a limited number of frequency available for you to communicate. And with 5G, this split becomes much more possible and easy to do between, say, commercial and government entities. You don't want your security services to talk on the same channels that a retailer does, is it? And so they really have to be split. But with 5G is much easier because the way it works, it's fundamentally different. Now, the machine learning type of modeling can be used to find the frequencies available and move dynamically, or the output of the machine learning models to be used to decide what to move to what frequency dynamically. And this is done seamlessly. The user is not gonna be impacted, not gonna feel anything, but it does mitigate the capacity issue, the bottleneck that we all see, for example, right now with Wi-Fi. You have congestion on Wi-Fi, and all of a sudden becomes slow. It may even time out, lose connection for a little while, and you'd say broadband doesn't work. But in fact, it's a congestion of the radio spectrum, frequency spectrum, that Wi-Fi is using it. So 5G actually resolves that, at least for a while. We know the more capacity we give, the more it's used. Will resolve that for quite a while, this capacity issue. And then when it comes to AI working with 5G, machine learning typically, but generally speaking AI, it can be used to address a number of high-hitting issues in mobile services. For example, resolving outages much faster, planning network capacity and general network planning when it comes to expansion. We see that 7-8 years down the line from launch of 4G, there's this densification work and capacity work being carried out quite significantly. So the same will happen with 5G, but using machine learning models that can be done much more efficiently and better. The same goes for the performance of the network. The same goes for the inherently addressing customer service problems. And definitely the security risk. So with 5G and the rise of IoT especially, the number of devices connected grows exponentially. It's actually mind-boggling. And so obviously the security risks are raising a lot. So machine learning can be effectively used to mitigate these security risks quite well. Also, it can be machine learning and other forms of artificial intelligence can be used for near real-time automated decision making. Again, technical decision making I'm talking about here, not anything relating to society as such and so on. Purely technical decision making, like predictive. What kind of resources do I have to bump up and where and when? Similar to supply chain problems. What do I have to supply? What kind of products? And where? And when? So it can be used as well. There's a few challenges here. The data quality, if data is of a poor quality, everything falls flat and not gonna work. Then also a lot of data sources for the data. There will be so many data sources that it become a bit difficult to manage. And the storage of data, it looks to be stored in too many places. That again give birth to silos, and silos, we know it's a death of any automation. Therefore, the death of AI systems too. They're not gonna work well at all if we don't manage that carefully. So in a one line, 5G is a huge enabler for any AI system.
Thank you so much, sir. Well, yes, 5G is going to be definitely very interesting. I mean, the latency, speed, massive IoT. I wouldn't be surprised if in next 5 years I would be sitting in an augmented reality conference room. But let's hope for the best. Anyway, I am aware that we are way past our time, but we have reserved this last conclusive question for Mr. Roger Spitz. So what is the new era in political technology, information warfare, and algorithmic diplomacy? What shifts and impacts relating to AI could we expect in geopolitics?
It's a huge topic, but I'll just give a few quick thoughts. I think the first area which I find quite interesting in relation to the question is that how much information is today driven by commercial entities. So when you look at some of the technologies we're talking about, AI, machine learning, autonomy, cyber, quantum, and that, most of these technologies are driven, at least in the West, by commercial companies as opposed necessarily to institutional or governmental. And that has a very important aspect, and data obviously feeds those technologies. The second thing which I find quite interesting and noteworthy is that the unlimited information is transforming society. I think all of us on the panel have discussed this aspect, but this is huge. So technology is really blurring the lines between what information comes from consumers or producers, amateurs or professionals, layman, experts, government, institutions, companies or institutionals. And that information, and unlimited information, has an impact which is not really fully understood yet. We're only starting to understand the implications of that, and in particular, how it can be used as quote unquote political technology by certain countries who may wish to do so. Another element I would add is that some of the trade restrictions around sensitive technologies which we put in place have accelerated the position of China in AI, for instance. And China has obviously a very strong strategy where the lines may not be as the same between commercial, institutional, and governmental or military, to say the least. And so when you look at, for instance, breakthroughs in technology and AI and machine learning, a lot of it is coming through chips and through machine learning and through the hardware side, image, language recognition, etc. And so where there are fewer safeguards in China, AI's national competitiveness, given the scale, the fewer safeguards, when you look at technologies like AI, biometrics, surveillance across every single industry, and the scale of that, you're reaching certain breakthroughs and scale, which will have ramifications geopolitically in terms of the positions of different countries. And I would add that information is security and cybersecurity, and what does it mean in terms of the quantum race and the quantum breakthroughs, in terms of the implications for cybersecurity and countries like Israel and the US and France and most countries in the world are asking that very same question about security, cybersecurity, and those breakthroughs. So when you look at recent news this week, it was interesting to see the US and the UK joining forces as an AI partnership to basically combine the research. I think it was Michael Kratsios, the US CTO, who basically is, put forward some of the reasons why there's this UK US alliance, and that's basically on a geopolitical level. And a lot of it is driven by AI, aka information and data. And the final point I would make is that I think there's a risk of what might seem like randomness about polarized society, polarized views in terms of COVID and climate change and social topics, vaccines, voting. We talked about TikTok and social media. I guess the question is, in whose interest is it to have some of these countries be destabilized and weakened by this polarization? And what does it mean? And I personally worry, and I know, Emmanuel and of course, Eugenio and all of us have talked about, Nicole, ethics and these considerations. I wonder whether some of the values we think we have and are trying to preserve in the West around ethics and privacy, in particular, you take the UK, which just put through legislation for the retention of fingerprints and DNA profiles in the interest of national security. And we're all giving ourselves comfort. I think Emmanuel used this wonderful term in terms of cosmetics around ethics. In reality, we're not necessarily leveraging the commercial benefits of what AI and technology can do. This information is meaning that the populations and society is polarized, and therefore when you look at the whole ad hoc testing, uncoordinated tracing, uncoordinated tracking, random quarantine process, which isn't necessarily effective, one of the reasons is that it might not be a limitation of technology or AI. It might actually be what is intentional in terms of destabilizing and political technology and information, and make it more difficult for governments and society to be aligned and to move towards areas which might sort of seem more effective. And so that last point is a little bit sensitive, and I don't know whether I did a good job in trying to explain it, but I personally think that it's directly driven by information and potentially political technology.
Thank you so much. I think it was an amazing concluding remark. So we are at the end of the panel discussion. So as the key moderator for this panel, I would like to conclude in very simple words that number one, we have discussed the real plurilateral issues with regards AI ethics and diplomacy. I think that's something which is a very nice threshold. Number two, we have actually gone through the real understanding of how multilateralism can, obviously it cannot outpace the growth of MNCs, the growth of companies, and also the other issues related to the consequences of how AI is utilized. And it's not just companies, I believe it's also governments, it's also other small entities and big entities in whatsoever manner. The third aspect, which is very interesting, is that multilateralism with regards to issues related to AI can be fulfilled. However, the fulfillment is not easy. The fulfillment requires better plurilateral efforts. Obviously, that's the simple ground norm. You come up with some basic principles and then you come up with solutions. And when consensus is formed, it takes time. That's how your information age works. One thing is for sure that and the last thing, which is the concluding remark from my side as the moderator, is that if that's the case, then I think the best solution might be, I'm not saying it's the final solution, I'm just an opinion, that companies, governments who are collaborating for better principles, better solutions, as Mr. Gopi and Nicole rightly pointed out, and also our dear panelists, can actually come up with transitional principles. For example, you're transitioning, but you're not outpacing the development of AI itself, because that's also an issue with GDPR, I think, and also other regulations which are predominantly very popular and also very important. So thank you so much to all the panelists who have been present in this session. Thank you to the audience who has been patient. And thank you to my co-moderator and mate Akash. So it's really been a great moment, and I really thank all the moderators for their presence. Over to you, Akash.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would request every panelist and the core member to kindly stay back for last 2 minutes. We just need a screenshot of our social media team. I hope that is all right with you.